Erika Kirk is facing another serious inconsistency in her public story, and critics say this one raises even bigger questions than before. Newly resurfaced material appears to show Erika participating in pageants years before the 2012 Miss Arizona competition she previously described as her first experience in that world. Photos from the 2010 Miss Colorado USA pageant, which took place in late 2009, reportedly show Erika competing on stage well before the timeline she later shared publicly. Standing alongside her in that same event was Lindsay Halligan, a figure who would later become nationally known after being appointed by President Trump as interim U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia in 2025 before a federal judge later challenged the legality of the appointment. Two women appearing together in a Colorado pageant years earlier would later rise into highly influential political and institutional circles, creating a connection that many online researchers now find difficult to ignore. What has drawn so much attention is not simply the existence of the pageant photos, but the contrast between those images and Erika's own descriptions of her background. In multiple interviews, she portrayed entering the Miss Arizona competition as something almost accidental, describing it as a casual opportunity that unexpectedly introduced her to pageantry. She framed the experience as though it marked the very beginning of her involvement in that environment. But the resurfaced Colorado pageant material appears to challenge that version of events entirely, suggesting she had already spent years participating in organized beauty competitions before the public timeline she later presented. Critics argue this moves beyond a simple memory issue and instead raises questions about whether parts of her public image were intentionally shaped to appear more spontaneous and relatable. The overlap with Lindsay Halligan has added another layer to the discussion because of how many similarities exist between their backgrounds. Both women attended Regis University, both moved through Trump-connected political circles, and both eventually found themselves connected to influential positions by 2025. Observers have pointed out that Halligan's rise into a major federal legal role was itself controversial, with critics questioning whether traditional qualifications and merit-based standards had been bypassed during the appointment process. Some researchers now compare that situation to Erika's own rapid rise after Charlie's death, particularly her appointment as CEO of Turning Point USA only days later through a succession process critics claim relied heavily on an audio recording that has never been independently authenticated. The conversation intensified further after comments from Candace Owens, who publicly argued that Erika's pursuit of fame began long before her public profile exploded. According to Candace, pageants were not a random chapter in Erika's life, but part of a much longer effort to gain recognition and visibility. Candace also discussed Erika's mother, Lori Fran, claiming she played a major role in encouraging that path early on. Lori's own background in modeling has fueled speculation that Erika's progression from pageants into public influence may have followed a familiar blueprint already established within her family. Critics argue that this context makes Erika's later portrayal of herself as someone who reluctantly entered the spotlight appear increasingly difficult to reconcile with the available timeline. Resurfaced interviews from Erika's younger years appear to reinforce that interpretation. In older footage, she openly discussed ambitions of becoming a Hollywood actress and achieving fame, presenting a version of herself very different from the modest and accidental narrative she later embraced publicly. Supporters say there is nothing unusual about having ambitions or pursuing opportunities, but critics argue the issue is the gap between those early ambitions and the carefully curated story later presented to audiences. Several people connected to Erika's past have also allegedly described her as highly determined to climb socially and professionally, with one reported former partner claiming he had been warned by individuals in the pageant world that both Erika and her mother were extremely focused on achieving influence and status. Another connection drawing attention is Erika's time working at the Corcoran Group beginning in 2018. At first glance, the move appeared like a normal transition into New York real estate, fitting naturally with her growing professional network. But researchers later noted that the Corcoran Group appears repeatedly throughout documents connected to Jeffrey Epstein. According to those reviewing the files, the company is referenced more than 100 times, including communications involving agents discussing properties and transactions with Epstein directly. During the same period Erika worked there, company leadership also reportedly appeared in those records, creating another controversial overlap now being heavily examined online. Critics are careful to point out that none of these connections prove direct wrongdoing by Erika herself. However, they argue that the growing number of overlaps involving pageants, political figures, influential organizations, and Epstein-related networks continues to fuel public scrutiny. What keeps the story alive is not one isolated event, but the way multiple timelines, relationships, and resurfaced details seem to intersect repeatedly across different stages of her life. The involvement of the company's CEO, Pamela Liebman, in records connected to Epstein added another layer to the growing scrutiny surrounding Erika's professional background. Critics argue that while this connection alone does not prove Erika herself engaged in wrongdoing, it undeniably places part of her career inside an organization repeatedly referenced within one of the most notorious criminal investigations in modern American history. Supporters insist guilt by association is unfair, but opponents say the issue is the growing pattern of overlaps that continue surfacing around her timeline. They also point to the fact that Erika has remained publicly quiet regarding the Epstein files since Charlie's death, despite how aggressively Charlie pushed for those files to be released without redactions. To some observers, that silence has become another unanswered question feeding wider public suspicion. When Erika's relationships, pageant history, political connections, and family background are examined together, some researchers argue the overall picture becomes increasingly difficult to dismiss as random coincidence. Individually, each detail might appear minor or circumstantial. But critics claim the concern comes from how frequently the same names, institutions, and influential circles appear throughout different stages of her life story. According to those following the controversy closely, it is the accumulation of these overlaps that has transformed online curiosity into a much larger public debate. At the center of that debate are the issues that reportedly mattered most to Charlie during the final years of his life: releasing the unredacted Epstein files and preventing a military conflict with Iran. Friends, supporters, and insiders have described both causes as defining missions for him rather than temporary political talking points. Charlie spoke repeatedly about the need for transparency regarding Epstein-related documents, arguing the public deserved to know the truth and that powerful figures connected to the files should face accountability. He reportedly viewed the suppression of that information as evidence of institutional corruption and believed his platform carried a responsibility to challenge it directly. His position on Iran followed the same intense pattern of public advocacy. Starting in 2019, Charlie consistently warned against the possibility of another American war in the Middle East. Over the following years, his statements became increasingly urgent, with him describing direct conflict with Iran as a catastrophic mistake that could have devastating consequences. Reports later claimed he personally visited the White House in 2025 to urge officials against escalating tensions further. Around that same period, he also conducted an online poll in which an overwhelming majority of his audience reportedly opposed American involvement in Israel's conflict with Iran. These positions became deeply connected to how many of his followers understood his legacy. That is why critics have reacted so strongly to Erika's silence and public positioning after Charlie's passing. Observers point out that she has avoided publicly advancing the Epstein transparency campaign that Charlie championed so aggressively. They also note that she later expressed support for military actions Charlie himself had warned against. For many longtime supporters of Charlie, those differences feel impossible to ignore. Some now question whether the values and causes he spent years defending are actually being preserved by the people claiming to continue his mission. The controversy surrounding Erika continues growing because critics believe the individual pieces of the story reinforce one another when placed side by side. The disputed pageant timeline, the Lindsay Halligan connection, the Corcoran Group overlap with Epstein-related records, the Crosby Street questions, claims about strategically beneficial relationships, resurfaced interviews discussing fame and ambition, the rapid leadership succession after Charlie's death, the leaked hot mic moments, and finally, the silence surrounding the exact causes Charlie fought hardest to promote before he died. Supporters insist these details are being unfairly combined into a misleading narrative, while critics argue the repetition of overlapping connections demands serious scrutiny. Figures like Candace Owens and Joe Rogan, along with various commentators and online investigators, have continued discussing these issues publicly, helping fuel even wider interest in the story. Each newly surfaced interview, archived image, leaked message, or public record adds more attention rather than resolving the controversy. Critics say the picture appears to become clearer with every new discovery, while supporters argue internet speculation is weaving unrelated facts into an exaggerated narrative. For many people watching online, the discussion has evolved beyond Erika herself and turned into something larger involving media influence, political networks, celebrity culture, and the hidden relationships that can shape public power behind the scenes. And as more archived material continues surfacing across the internet, few expect the debate to disappear anytime soon.